I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone here this morning, as well as to welcome everyone who might be watching later, as this meeting is broadcast on Hudson Cable Television. Next, Allison Feaster will lead us in the pledge and the four-way test.
Thank you. Are you ready? Yes. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next, the four-way test. First, is it true? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it be without prejudice? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, Allison. And next, Catherine Sines for this morning's invocation. Catherine.
Good morning, Rotarians. Please join me in prayer. Dear Lord, you have given most of mankind a strong desire to do good and to be honest and to serve others and to faithfully fulfill their obligations to their neighbors. Help us as Rotarians and humans to do good. Help us as Rotarians and humans to be honest and ethical in all our dealings. Help us as humans and Rotarians to serve others. And help us as Rotarians and humans to faithfully fulfill our obligation as neighbors in our community, our nation, and our world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Catherine. And next up, this morning's song by our songmeister, Dick Pearsall. Dick.
I'm glad to be back. I can tell you I was contagious a couple of weeks ago, but last week I was playing hooky. On Valentine's Day, my wife and I drove up to the new Hilton in Cleveland and celebrated her Valentine's birthday of 98 years. Oh, yeah. Phenomenal lady, I can tell you that. Anyway, I found out that you didn't sing America the Beautiful last week, and it's such a wonderful thing outside. I just thought we ought to sing it. So let's go. Oh, beautiful for spacious sky, for amber waves of rain, for God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. It's wonderful to be back.
Thank you, Dick, and it's wonderful to have you back. Announcements. Real quickly, there is a meeting of the foundation board after the club meeting. That meeting will be held in the Greenwood Dining Room. That is an opportunity for new members as well. It's one of the items on your little checkoff list. So again, that's the foundation board. They are meeting in the Greenwood Dining Room after this meeting. Jim Ahern wanted to share a couple of things about the speech contest. Jim.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. 98 years. Wow, Dick. That's it's really impressive. Amazing. I'm going to have a meeting after this meeting for the judges, just to go through. The district has done a nice job. They really improved the scoring sheet and some information about it. So I just want to spend 5 or 10 minutes. I want to thank the judges, Chris Barker, Mimi Becker, Tom Page, Gail Royster, George Snyder, Liz Kwolek, and Evan McCauley, of which most of you aren't here. So I'll have to make sure they're here next week. But if the folks that are here can meet afterwards, that would be great. And we're still on board. We got about 10 kids signed up from each school. Wish we had more, but both the teachers at both the academy and at Hudson say, there's a lot of procrastination going on with things like this. So we'll see. We'll get more, hopefully. All right.
Thank you, Jim. Any other announcements from any members from the floor? Okay. Next up, this morning's speaker, Roseanne Drake, if you'd do the honors of the introduction.
Good morning, Rotarians. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Ambassador Heather Hodges. She became president and ambassador in residence at the Cleveland Council on World Affairs on November 2011 after retiring from 31 years in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Hodges did consular work in Venezuela and Guatemala. She was consul general in Bilbao, Spain, and was deputy chief of mission in Managua, Lima, and Madrid. In Washington, she was Peru desk officer and deputy director of Cuban Affairs and had a fellowship to work on the Senate Subcommittee for Immigration and Refugee Affairs. She was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Resources from 2006 to 2008. And Ms. Hodges was Ambassador to Moldova from 2003 to 2006 and Ambassador to Ecuador from 2008 to April of 2011. Ambassador Hodges is a native of Westlake, Ohio, a graduate of Magnificat High School. She is now on the board of their board of directors. She has a BA in Spanish from St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and an MA from New York University. She was elected to the American Academy of Diplomacy in 2011, excuse me, and is on the advisory council of the Rainforest Trust, which is a U.S.-based nonprofit environmental organization. So please join me in giving a warm Rotary welcome to Heather Hodges.
Trying to figure out where to put the glass so I don't spill the water. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I've spoken over the years to a number of Rotary groups, both national and international, overseas. I'm almost laughing today because when I spoke to Roseanne about coming here, I was worried about the snow. I live in Bay Village, and I thought, well, who knows, maybe have to cancel at the last minute. And instead, we barely need to have a jacket on, so it makes being here nicer and a little bit easier to get here on time. I'm going to talk to you about what diplomats do. It's one of the things I like to do is help people learn about what people do, what the U.S. Foreign Service does, or people from the Department of State do overseas, and also in Washington, because much of our work is actually in Washington as well. So I'd like to start, well, actually, before I get going on that, let me just say 2 words about the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. That is the organization that I'm affiliated with here in Cleveland, and many of you may be familiar with it. Many of you over the years may have hosted international visitors who were here in Cleveland under the auspices of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. We're nearly 100 years old, founded by women who were interested after World War I in bringing about peace in the world, and then eventually some men got connected to the organization and began what is now today the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and also a group called the Cleveland Committee on Foreign Relations. We have 2 speaker series that are fabulous. One is member only, which we don't advertise the speakers because it is a members only series. Last night we had an expert on North Korea, and it was chilling. A real expert knowing what's going on in North Korea. It was fabulous. We have a public series that you may hear on NPR. We advertise there, plus on our website. Coming up is Aaron Miller of Cleveland is going to be speaking about the Middle East, and that's on March 7. On April 11, we have a woman who was the lead negotiator for the Paris Climate Agreement. And she will be speaking about what's the next steps on the Paris Agreement. And on May 16, we have Ambassador Charles Rees, who was ambassador to Greece, now working with the RAND Corporation, and he's going to be talking about Brexit and what it would mean for the United States and for the EU. We also have international the Department of State brings in international visitors, and when they come to Cleveland, we organize their programs, and often there's opportunities for people to host these visitors for a dinner. And if you're interested, or if you think any of your family members might be interested, please contact us. We also do Model UN for high school students, which you may have children or grandchildren or yourselves may have participated in. It's been around since before the UN Charter was actually signed. And it has help shape the awareness of many young people here in Cleveland about global affairs. So we're proud of all those programs, and if you're interested in more information, we are ccwa.org on the website. I thought I'd start out with a definition, the standard definition of diplomacy. Diplomacy is the art and practice of conducting negotiations between representatives of groups or states. It usually refers to international diplomacy, the conduct of international relations through the intercession of professional diplomats with regard to issues of peacemaking, trade, war, economics, culture, environment, and human rights. Now, some of you also may think of what you may be thinking, well, I know what a diplomat does, or I know what this is all about. I thought I'd give you a few amusing quotations about diplomats and diplomacy. Diplomacy is the act of letting someone else have your way. A diplomat is a person who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you actually look forward to the trip. And a diplomat is a person who has been sent abroad to lie for the good of his nation, his or her nation. Right. Now, in the United States, we refer to our diplomats as foreign service, the career people, as foreign service officers, and these are people who work for the Department of State. I don't know why we don't talk about the U.S. Diplomatic Corps. We talk about the United States Foreign Service. And maybe the use of the word service is good, the emphasis being that we are overseas serving our country and also serving American citizens overseas, serving business interests, and doing what is necessary for the United States in carrying out strategic interests with other countries. First of all, where do they work? The U.S. maintains diplomatic relations with 195 countries, and we maintain embassies in almost all of those countries. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, we decided that even with some of these countries that were part of the Soviet Union, that we would, as these countries became independent, that we would establish diplomatic relations with all these countries. And sometimes there are very small countries, and one could say that there aren't any particular interests in those countries, but it was a policy that was decided on, so we have diplomatic missions almost everywhere in the world. And, in Spanish Guinea, there's a very small, very dangerous kind of reptilian-filled country where I certainly would never have gone. But and at first we wondered why we were going to bother when they became independent, why we were going to bother to have an embassy there. But it turns out they have oil, and eventually American oil companies came in, and it was very good to have a presence in order to help the American oil companies in dealing with the government of Guinea. At an embassy, you have the ambassador is the representative of the President of the United States, and has the duty of carrying out what is policy that has been developed through the Department of State, through the White House, with regard to the country you're in, or to multilateral issues. Right now, let me say, because I always get this question, of the ambassadors overseas, about 1/3 are political appointees, and the rest, 2/3 are tend to be career Foreign Service officers. Not always Department of State. Sometimes they're from another agency, but they are career people. This is standard. It doesn't matter if it's Republicans or Democrats. It is a standard procedure, and the political appointees mostly go to Western Europe, and the career people go to the less desirable spots, right? But we accept that, we know that, and we're still very happy to serve in any country. The ambassador is responsible for making sure that everybody at the embassy is talking about issues in the same way, with the same policy, and that it is the policy of the United States. When you join the Foreign Service, you agree to go along with whatever is the policy on an issue of the United States. Sometimes that's very easy because you don't disagree, and sometimes it can be hard, because you're not too sure that this is the policy that if you were in charge that you would carry out. But you salute and you move on. And I know that you've seen a lot of things in the newspaper about people disagreeing with the recent policy on refugees. That will be worked out. But the people who are in the Foreign Service, they express themselves in what was called a dissent channel. But once they have expressed their opinions, then they will move forward with whatever the policy is and the instructions that they are given, right? The size of an embassy varies widely. I was in Moldova, and I'm not too sure all of you know where Moldova is. It's the former Soviet Republic, and it's a very small country of 5 million and shrinking, a lot of people emigrating overseas. We had a staff, I think, if 50, I'm not sure we even had 50, and of those only about, let's say, 15 were Americans, and the others were local employees. But that was a very small American embassy. American embassies can have 1,000 or more employees. You can imagine that Baghdad is a very large embassy. In Cairo, we have a very large embassy. Mexico City, another very large embassy. And many of these employees are local employees. They're called Foreign Service nationals, whom we rely on tremendously to help us with culture, to understand understand, any nuances of the language. That usually our people do speak the language, but the local employees help people get to know what's going on locally. They are wonderful people to consult with when it comes to economic issues in a country, much more than the newly arrived economic officer. The local employees are the ones who have a sense of what's going on, whether or not an American businessman or woman will have a fair level playing field for their particular investment and things like that. But other than the ambassador, we have many Americans who are either a part of the American or the Department of State Foreign Service or other American agencies that have interests abroad. So, for example, an embassy may have a commercial attaché that has been sent by the Department of Commerce. And when it comes to commerce, they don't have an office everywhere. They just don't have the budget to do that. But when there are interests that make it worthwhile, they will send an officer from the Foreign Commercial Service. You have DEA. Many embassies these days have many DEA agents who work with the local police and law enforcement personnel to work on counter narcotics, fighting against trafficking and things like that. Department of Justice, FBI, liaison work with local governments. The USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is sort of a branch of the Department of State, but in many countries, developing countries, they will have an office and work providing American assistance on programs that have been developed together with the local government or with development agencies in the country. I'll talk a little bit more about what the Department of State personnel do. The ambassador, of course, is out talking to people, getting to know what's going on. But beside him or her, you have various specializations within the Foreign Service, what people are working on. So you have a political officer. The political officers will go out and talk to people at the foreign ministry. They may talk to people in non-governmental organizations. They report on the political situation, and a lot of the work of the Department of State and Foreign Service officers is writing what we call cables back to Washington, and giving reports on what's going on, maybe talking about human rights, maybe talking about trafficking in persons, in the political situation, how stable is the government, how honest is the government, what's the relationship with the media in a particular country. It's a very important part of our work. We have economic officers who look at the economic situation, who are reporting on various often on what the government the host government is planning on doing, and what the inflation rate is. Many things like that. It's that the Department of State depends on, in order to know what's going on, what the stability of the country is, and what we can expect in the future. Trade policy is a big one. And the economic officers overseas will often do the work of the commercial work and assisting American business persons locally. When there isn't a commercial officer, the economic officer will also do that. We have public affairs officers who watch out for the ambassador's relations with the public in the country that they are in, and an information officer, in other words, a press attaché, who will give information about U.S. policies and often arrange, for the ambassador to be speaking to groups or on TV or on radio or whatever. We also have cultural affairs officers who used to do a little bit more when it came to bringing culture from the United States overseas, but budgets have become such that, and it's very expensive, like to even bring in a small jazz group or whatever. And so there's less of that than there used to be. But we do take advantage of a few grants that will come up and bring in these groups that can play around the country, and it's really very good for goodwill in the country. The cultural officer, cultural attaché, also handles Fulbright grants in recognizing rising leaders who might be nominated by the embassy to come to the United States, and that's what I was talking about, that we handle them when they are in Cleveland, and doing other things that provide for goodwill between the United States and the host country. There's people who do administrative support and security functions. There's something called diplomatic security, and they watch out for the safety. Not only, and the ambassador is also one of your primary missions is to watch out for the safety of American citizens overseas, both the people that are at the embassy and people that are visiting. And so you will find that if there's something particularly dangerous going on, that the security officer will make sure that the American citizens who are registered in the country receive notification of anything that they should be concerned about. The consular people are the consular affairs officers are the ones you most likely could run into overseas, especially if you lost a passport or had a passport stolen, because a lot of times it's not just lost, it was stolen from you, pickpocketed. But you go to the American embassy and they will help get you at least documentation so that you can get back into the country. In the old days, we printed the passports at the embassies, but we don't do that anymore, so the passport actually has to come from the United States. But the consular officers can help you get the documentation that you need to come into the country. Consular officers also, in general, watch out for the welfare of American citizens. So if you happen to have a child or a grandson or a granddaughter who hasn't reported home for a long time and is traveling in who knows where, and you're very, very worried, and that person used to contact you every day, and suddenly you're not hearing from him or her, there is a sort of hotline that you can call at the Department of State, and depending on the circumstances, they may actually initiate an investigation to find out, if the person is all right. Most of the time, it turns out they are all right. They just forget to call home. But not always, and so we're glad to be of service in that way. The consular officer, when an American dies overseas, is the one to notify the family back in the United States and provide for disposition of the remains. When a baby is born to American citizens overseas, the family has to go in with the baby and present the baby to the consular officer so that the consular officer can issue a certificate of birth abroad, if that person has a right, that child has a right to American citizenship. You also, the consular officers, look out for, will visit Americans who are in jail overseas, and there's a lot of Americans in jail overseas, and you often will go about once a month to visit the people that are in jail, depending on how far the jail is from the capital. But you do that, help make sure that they've got the right medicines if they need it. The family will sometimes send food or things like that, and it is one of the responsibilities. And also the consular section will write this report on the conditions in a country, and that is on the website of the Department of State. So if you are traveling overseas, or a member of your family is traveling overseas, and you're worried about the safety in that country, please go to the website of the Department of State and look at it, and they will give you very clear information. If there's danger, they will say it. And sometimes they even say, don't get on the local buses, right? Or if you're going to take a cab, make sure you get the cab at a hotel, right? Or things like that, because it's based on the experience of that embassy, and where Americans have been mugged or where they've had unfortunate incidents. So it's definitely worth doing. Another thing consular officers do is issue visas. Issue visas for immigrants, issue visas for non-immigrants, and that includes students. And also visas for, we'll do much of the work on the refugee documentation, which has been in the news so much lately. There are also officers that work on refugee issues, but depending on where you are, it may fall to the consular officers. The getting into the Foreign Service is very competitive. There's an exam process. If you think somebody in your family might be interested, you might also check that out on the website. Get information about what is required. There is no degree that's required. There is no, and not even a language is required. Later on, you have to learn a language in order to continue. And it's good if you have other languages. But they first get you through the written exam and then an oral examination and a security background investigation, and then on to coming into the Foreign Service, depending on how many openings there are a year. It's a fairly competitive examination, but it's not impossible. And I always tell younger people, if they think they're interested in the Foreign Service, to take the exam for practice. And there's no harm in doing that, and they can see where they have gaps in their background, and then use that to go on to take the exam maybe later on. You heard my mini bio. I spoke Spanish when I came into the Foreign Service, so that meant I didn't have to stop off at the Foreign Service Institute to learn Spanish. Instead, I immediately went on to a job in Venezuela as a vice consul in Guatemala, and then from there, it was really a fabulous career. I was living in Madrid before I joined the Foreign Service, and almost regretted leaving Madrid. But I got back to Madrid as the deputy chief of mission, which is the #2 in the embassy, and that was a great thrill to go back and see old friends and be back in a city that I love very much. There are downsides of the Foreign Service. You've heard about many serious security problems overseas, Benghazi being perhaps the most notorious of all of the things, but it's by no means the only time that American diplomats have been killed. Between 1973 and 2013, 76 Americans were killed overseas in diplomatic positions and killed in the line of duty. And you do nowadays especially have to worry more and more about security concerns, not just in what appear to be the more dangerous countries, but also in countries like France or Great Britain or wherever. And the security posture is high on the minds of everybody. On the other hand, there are great perks, the advantage of living in several places. If you don't like one place, you'll be moving on after 2 or 3 years. So, that's, it's a nice thing. And for people with children, it's also, it's very educational, although some of the children of Foreign Service officers, like military children, say that they'll never travel again after they get away from their parents because it's too much moving on. But most of them really enjoy the experience. Very briefly, I'll tell you my own very unusual experience. If you all have heard about WikiLeaks, that came out, that started in Corporal Manning handed over cables. These were reporting cables that I was just talking about. Handed over over 250,000 cables that were from about 10 years worth of cables reporting from embassies back to Washington. And first of all, he was no whistleblower whistleblower because I'm sure he hadn't even read any of those. And, I think that whistleblowers, you have to know, what you're talking about to complain about it, to release information. This is just handing over cables wholesale without looking at the content or worrying about the lives of people mentioned in the cables and things like that. Well, in Ecuador, we had not the smoothest relationship with the government of Ecuador, and we were always very honest in our reporting to Washington about the relationship, about the fact that President Correa had very much of a populist, sort of a mini Chavez, and had terrible relations with the media, always referred to, and still does, to the press as the corrupt press, buying off media in limiting the kind of information that was given, and things like that. So there was a lot of very frank reporting to Washington. And I figured out that President Correa wasn't going to like some of the things that we had reported. But this got to be 2011, and it was, April, and I thought, gee, I'm due out of here in July. Maybe I'll get out of here without any, him getting too upset or anybody else in the government getting too upset. And then a cable came out that was talking about corruption and the former chief of police. We wanted to cancel his visa, and it was really a very low-level cable in the sense of it went to consular affairs requesting to cancel his visa. He was known for corruption and trafficking in persons, and everybody in the country knew that he was corrupt. And when you write cables at an embassy, it's not me sitting down every night writing a cable. My name is at the bottom of the cable, but people throughout the embassy are writing reports, and depending on the level and the sensitivity of a cable, maybe the ambassador sees it and maybe not, right? And just to get things moving, right? Well, this particular cable had a line in it that said, some embassy officials believe that President Correa knew that Commander Hurtado was corrupt and named him on purpose so he could manipulate him. And it's unusual to make a comment like some embassy officials, because usually you say, we believe, or you don't put it in. But it was there, and to this day, I believe probably it was DEA that threw that line in there, wanting to, express their opinion. And so it was, no matter what, it was there that, somebody in the embassy thought that President Correa knew about the corruption of the commander. Anyway, that really upset the government. I think they were looking for an excuse anyhow, because, I had never done anything out in public. I had never criticized the government. I was not dancing on tables in drunken stupors. And just in general, I'd been fairly low-key publicly, but there was this criticism, and much worse was going to come. There were some cables that I knew they weren't going to like. Anyway, I was called into the foreign ministry, and the foreign minister, who is a rather unpleasant individual, said, hand over, who are your sources? And hand over all of the cables that you've written, and just sort of made some absolutely impossible demands. And I said, well, I'll let Washington know that you've expressed these desires. And after 5 minutes, he said, well, thank you. And so that was the end of that. Well, the next day, they had declared me persona non grata. And it's the only country in the world that went to the extreme of declaring an ambassador to be persona non grata over the whole WikiLeaks issue, right? President Correa is very thin-skinned, obviously, and I don't know if they just wanted me out of the way or whatever, but they told me to leave as soon as possible, and I left within a week. And we turned around and kicked their ambassador out, and to be reciprocal about things. And so that's sort of my story. I was already retiring. I had already bought my house in Bay Village. It didn't, affect me, except that it's a sad way to end a career, and especially because I really hadn't done anything in particular to deserve that fate, right? But I will have you know that this kid from Cleveland, right, is the first female U.S. ambassador ever to have been declared persona non grata. Thank you. Yeah, Any questions? I guess I'm supposed to wait till a microphone gets to you.
Hi, I'm over here. Interesting, interesting. But I currently have a Fulbright scholar from Papua New Guinea here finishing a master's thesis. I'm not sure, and if you could explain how the system for a Fulbright scholar works. Okay, because you mentioned it and I was interested.
Right. Every embassy, there's a Fulbright. Fulbright, of course, goes back to, I don't know how many years now, many years, when the scholarships that were established for the exchanges, both U.S. to go overseas and from people from overseas to come to the United States. And there are sort of scholarships at different levels. Do you know if this is graduate? Yeah, master's degree. That's probably the most common. And there's usually the commission, there's a group in the country, in the host country, and in the United States looking for, what we're interested in people from a particular country being able to come to the United States, what the topics, what they might be interested in learning. They apply. Usually it's a fairly competitive process. Language skills are looked at, and what they are interested in studying. Sometimes it's teachers, especially going towards the host country. We have a lot of people who are university professors who want to get a little experience overseas. They will apply. Some, it can be a year, it can be, a few months, it can be, long getting a master's, whatever. But it's certainly, it's a program which, in my opinion, has been very good for relations with the United States and the rest of the world, because these are people. It's one of the few opportunities that the U.S. government is sponsoring studying in the United States. And it's a shame, but we just don't have the money for people to come. To study, get a master's or a PhD, but through the Fulbright program, that is possible, and people have to, and they are supposed to go back to their country, and we believe that the money that we have spent on that is a great investment, and that the goodwill is there for the rest of their lives, and they learn best practices from our point of view, at least, and will be able to share that in their countries. Right. Great program. Right.
Yes. Is there a period of time that most diplomats serve? And what about the pay of diplomats? Does it range from the small to the big ones?
The what? The pay?
Yes, the pay, your remuneration.
Yeah, right. Usually you're in a country for 2 to 3 years overseas, and then you can also serve in Washington for several years. The career, it's very much like the military when it comes to the career span. First, you are in the Foreign Service, and that runs up to about 20 to 25 years. And then at a certain point, it's just like the military, you apply to be, like the military to be a general. Well, we applied to get into the Senior Foreign Service. And if you're not in the numbers, it's a pyramid. And so if you don't get into the Senior Foreign Service at a particular point, then you are out. If you're in the Senior Foreign Service, same thing happens. You go up, the rankings, and from, there are maybe 4 levels, the way the generals do as well. And if you don't make it within a certain number of years, you're out, on your way up, right? So I was in the Foreign Service for 31 years, right? And there's also a mandatory retirement age of 65, right? So even no matter where you are, if you turn 65, unless you're an ambassador sitting in a Senate-confirmed appointment, you are out as well, right? Pay ranges are the same, more or less the same as civil service in the United States, but then you get a supplement depending, in some countries you get a supplement for danger, for health conditions, for things like that. We have a few posts are so dangerous that you can't take your family, and then you're only going to be there for a year. So examples of that are Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the hardship of not having your family is there, but then you get a nice supplement in your salary for that danger element and for the hardship of not having the family. So there's a lot of variation, but basically it's the same as the civil service. Yes.
Yeah, please. Hey, thank you for coming today. I've learned something that I didn't know before.
Good.
So thank you for your service. I have one question. You mentioned when you first started that you had a meeting yesterday with regard to the conditions in North Korea.
Yes.
I don't suppose you'd be willing to share some of that with us?
It was scary.
Was it really?
Yeah, we had an expert, a former Foreign Service officer who's an expert in North Korea, who's still in touch with the U.S. government and actually even with people in Korea, and writes. He works with the Madeleine Albright's group and also Brookings Institution, and so he's very up on what's going on. And the problem with North Korea is that there are no easy solutions to resolving what might be facing all of us, which is that one of these days North Korea is going to have enough nuclear power to hit the United States. They do now for South Korea, and that's, they particularly in Japan, they did a test while Prime Minister Abe of Japan was meeting with President Trump. They did a test, and maybe that was testing us. So the thing is that for many years we've put off resolving, what to do about North Korea, and we're going to have to face a decision one of these days. He was and. There are no good solutions, because the Chinese aren't going to do as much as what we would like them to do. The South Koreans are very concerned about what's going on, but also have their own problems and things. And he was particularly advocating for more sanctions and restrictions on North Korea that would help them make a decision between their survival and they most care about maintaining their regime, and so it made a very good argument for doing sort of a lot of sanctions and things that could speed up their decision-making process. It was.
They have a military of in excess of 1 million.
That's right. Unbelievable. Right. Yeah. Right. Now that's what he said. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh. Okay.
Yeah. 2 points. You talked about the council. I heard you in the library about a year ago, so I started attending some of the meetings
Yes.
at the Union Club. You all really, if you're interested in what's going on in the world, go to hear those speakers. It's you don't have to be a member. I think it cost me about $25 a session. I heard the former ambassador to Germany, who is an Iranian, speak about the nuclear pact that the United States and Iran had put together right after it was done. I also heard a representative talk about Turkey. I mean, that's kind of news that you just won't find in the newspaper. So I do suggest, if you want to, go to those meetings. It's really worthwhile. The real question for
Before you get to that, just let me add on to that. Thank you very much for that plug. Yes, I'm very proud of our speaker program. And yes, we helped the Hudson Library get going on the Great Decisions program that I hope you've enjoyed. I understand it's a pretty active group. But yeah, most of our speakers are American, but in the case you're talking about the Iranian, he was very interesting on the subject of Iranian relations with the U.S. and things. So thank you. Anyway, your question.
My question, since you had an Ecuadorian connection, what do you think is going to happen to Julian Assange?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, so Corporal Manning handed over his all these documents to Julian Assange, who took refuge in the asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and the connection between Assange and Ecuador is me. right? Because they, thanks to Julian Assange, President Correa managed to find a way to get me out of the country and everything. So they're buddy-buddy, right? And they are so, and they want to prove that they're not beholden to the gringos, right? And so they let Julian Assange stay at the embassy, which is a small place. And he's taking up one of their offices, and it's now his bedroom. He's not a particularly pleasant individual to deal with, I'm sure. And now of the various candidates for the president, and they just had elections on Sunday, a former vice president of President Correa is running and representing the ruling party, and then there are opposition leaders. Unfortunately, the opposition never gets its act together, so they split, and then you have, it's touch and go. They don't know whether or not the Lenin Moreno got enough votes to win outright, or they're going to have an overall a runoff election. Some of the candidates have said that if they became president, that they would kick Julian Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy. He's wanted on charges of rape by, is it Norway or Sweden, and so he just took refuge there and hasn't faced justice there. He claims he's doing it because we want him to be extradited. There's no request for that because he's wanted in Sweden, and then he claims that we would put him to death if he came to the United States. Well, extradition treaties always allow for the fact that you would not do that. I mean, even if that were the case, we would not be allowed to do that. So it's all in his own propaganda and everything. I hope they kick him out, but that's just my personal opinion.
On that note, in various countries where you have embassies, do you have dissidents that approach the embassy? And if so, what's the procedure for handling someone that is interested in overthrowing the government or whatever might be interested?
Right. There are procedures, and it's not like the movies most of the time. And usually, I mean, if there are people that are dissidents, they've often been in touch with the embassy and have found their ways of expressing things. We don't encourage people to take asylum in these countries. It can be very complicated, and the procedures are set between, the diplomatic security, things like that. You rarely have instances where the person actually ends up staying in the embassy. And I think, for example, there was a Chinese man a few years ago, a blind Chinese man who was at our embassy for a while, but it depends on every country what's going on, and people sometimes claim that they're being persecuted when it's not, and things like that. So you talk your way through and try to figure out what's going on, but it's not an everyday event, actually.
Do we have diplomatic relations with the European Union per se? Do we vision that as an entity in either Brussels or Strasbourg?
Yes. Obviously, we have diplomatic relations with every country that's in the European Union, but we also have an ambassador to the European Union. Right, and that ambassador, usually is an expert on, trade issues and things like that of what's going on. You really have to understand the EU, which is complicated, in order to have that job. But we have an embassy, so to speak, that handles issues related to the European Union. Yes.
This may be more, you brought up movies, so this may be more driven by movies, but in your department, is there any interaction at all between your department and, say, like CIA when they're operating in certain countries?
Yeah, I mean, if there are CIA officers in a country, they come under the authority of the ambassador. No matter what the ambassador is, right? And they are required, there are rules on what they're required to tell the ambassador or other people at an embassy. There are not necessarily CIA people at every embassy. And in some embassies, the government, the host country knows exactly who they are. The government is informed of who they are, and they're often working with the intelligence services in the country on, in issues of mutual interest, right? But no matter what, the maximum authority at an embassy is the ambassador.
Anyone else? Thank you, Ambassador Hodges. Fascinating discussion. Great questions. Thank you, members, for the questions. And again, thank you, Ambassador Hodges, for being here with us today. I'd like to thank the greeters this morning, Mimi Becker and Ron Barnhouse. Thank you for being greeters for the month of February. Greeters next month, Clint Samuel and Pete Opperman. And I'd like to thank as well the audiovisual setup crew, Tom Page, Tom Tobin, James Field, and Ron Barnhouse. Thank you again, gentlemen, for making that possible. It's important as we present our meetings on Hudson Cable Television. And Ariana Bankovich, thank you so much for your help this month. Service learning student has been a big help. We hope you've enjoyed being with us. We've enjoyed having you. You get to sleep in a little bit, I guess, maybe next month, right? And today's Rotobuck. Payout is $11, and the jackpot is $281. One member very happy. 8976. The last four digits, 8981.
We just traded tickets the last second there. Oh my God.
Yep. Okay.
All right.
You're just zigging and sagging a little bit.
Not today. Whoop, your envelope, Mr. Ahern?
Oh, yep.
Oh, that's funny.
Okay. Again, a reminder, after this meeting, there is a meeting of the Foundation Board in the Greenwood Dining Room. And next week, the program will be the kickoff for a gala. As they used to say, be here or be square. Be there, be square. And if you're not here, we will find you. You can run, but you cannot hide. Couple of thoughts as we close the meeting today. And this is World Affairs Month. I thought we'd go a little far afield, not very far afield, but beyond our borders. The first, and I'll let you guess the European leader who said this, not too long ago passed away, and a movie was made about this individual. Europe was created by history. America was created by philosophy. Margaret Thatcher, Dan Filburn, absolutely right. And the second, the human voice can never reach the distance that is covered by the still, small voice of conscience. Mahatma Gandhi. And with that, thank you everyone for being here. We'll see everybody next week.